What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be continuing on my series of reviews for the Alien franchise, this time around talking about the first of the two prequel films, and that film is called Prometheus. Let's take a trip back to 2012. Ridley Scott is back in the director's chair, and this film stars people like Noomi Rapace, Logan Marshall Green, Michael Fassbender, Charlize Theron, Idris Elba, and many more. Alright, so it's finally time to talk about the prequel films in this franchise. We've had a lot of fun talking about the first Alien from 1979. We had Aliens, then we had Alien 3, which was a bit of a disappointment, and then Alien 4, that's just, at that point, they had just kind of lost all control of what the franchise was, in my opinion. It was easily the weakest in the entire franchise, and out of all the films I've rewatched thus far, it was the one that I just found myself thinking, I can't see myself wanting to revisit this one anytime soon after this rewatch. But I was really excited to get to Prometheus because the prequel films are some of the newer films in the franchise that of course have the advantage of having the advancement of technology, whether it be in digital effects or just various other things like cinematography, camera quality, and just high-tech filmmaking. And so yeah, this was a film that I was really excited for when it came out, and I remember there being a pretty mixed reception on this film because some people didn't even know that it was a prequel to Alien, and those who did know it was a prequel to Alien, there was a big section of the audience that didn't really feel like it felt like an Alien film until the later half of the film. And while I do agree with that to some degree, I've always had a pretty positive outlook on Prometheus. I remember seeing it in theaters that first time and thinking this was a pretty solid movie that had a lot of intriguing and ambitious questions. And Ridley Scott returns to the franchise for the first time since that original film for 1979 to tell this story that takes place roughly around 30 years prior to the events of that original film. And so yeah, going into this one, right out of the gate, we're introduced to these aliens known as the Engineers, these pale white, large, muscular aliens. And at the very start of the film, we're introduced to one of these as they are standing on top of a waterfall, and they ingest some sort of black liquid, some sort of black goo that ends up getting them sick. They end up falling down this waterfall and disintegrating. It's a pretty weird cold open, but then we see the title card of this film and we get into what this movie is really all about, where we're introduced to Noomi Rapace's character, Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, as well as her lover, Logan Marshall Green's character, Charlie Holloway, and the two of them are scientists who back on Earth had been uncovering various artifacts or cave paintings that all had similar kind of imagery. And in this imagery you had humans that were worshiping some sort of larger being, of course that being these engineers, that's what they decide to call them. And in all of these various depictions they had orbs that were floating. They were able to use these orbs and the alignment of them to tell that it was actually a star system and find where that star system is super far away from Earth. So like a lot of the other films in the Alien franchise, we have a crew of individuals who in this case are on the ship called Prometheus, headed to a planet where they believe they may be able to find these engineers. And the reason they're the most interested to go and check out these engineers is because both Noomi Rapace's character and Logan Marshall Green's characters, they both believe that these may actually be the creators of the human species, which is why the humans were worshiping them in those various artifacts and imagery that they found. So they're really excited, and amidst them you also have people on the board who are captains and pilots, also people who are part of security detail that star people like Idris Elba and Charlize Theron. You even have people like Benedict Wong in here in a small role. So it's got a pretty solid cast throughout the whole thing. And man, let me just start this off by saying that I think the cast here is really strong. I mentioned earlier that I think that Prometheus has that advantage of being, you know, a newer film in the franchise. It's about 12 years old now, but I honestly think it still holds up really well when it comes down to its digital effects, its cinematography, the musical score throughout, and most notably the performances, with Noomi Rapace being the standout here. I think she's without a doubt one of the most interesting and most kind of like easy to root for protagonist that's in the entirety of the Alien franchise, and she's just somebody that you can really root for because she's not really a character who right out of the gate is coming into this with fear. In some of the other films, of course, right out of the gate we already kind of are dealing with the aliens, especially as you get a couple installments in. With this being a prequel, you have this character, most notably in Elizabeth Shaw, who is excited about going to this planet. She has this excitement to possibly meet her maker, to find out where humans came from, and to get there and obviously realize that it's all horrifying and that they should not have come to this planet looking for their makers and it was the worst decision they ever could have made, is really interesting because you have this character who has nothing but hope and faith, ultimately kind of having that destroyed as time goes on. And so, yeah, as they get to this planet, of course, we're introduced to the ship that we actually see at the very beginning of the original film, where they end up finding, of course, the eggs with the xenomorphs and the face huggers and all that jazz. And so, you know, obviously immediately you're starting to see those connections, at least visually, to the original film. But this is a film that really sets up the creation of not only humans and kind of how that came to be and how the engineers play a bigger role in all of it, but also kind of showcases the early birthing place of the xenomorphs. We get to see a very early form of a xenomorph in this film in the later half of the film, and we'll get into that in just a second. But another character that's very pivotal to talk about here is the character of David, who is the android on board. He's the only one, of course, when we first open the film, who is currently conscious, as all of the other characters are in hypersleep, as we typically see a lot of these characters in a lot of these movies. And so David is played by Michael Fassbender, and I think he gives an incredible performance here, and is probably my favorite of the android characters next to Bishop from Aliens. And I think Michael Fassbender does an incredible job here with his performance, very much able to bring that robotic energy that you want from one of these androids, while also bringing something new to it. It's definitely one of the most memorable performances in the film, and you learn pretty quickly that he has an agenda going on under the surface. This is probably one of the more intelligent, or a little bit more deceitful, of all of the various androids that we've seen in all the films. And that's not something that's new to the franchise. Going back to the original film, I mean, you have androids who have, you know, definitely had some sort of underlying agenda. Now, one thing I have to mention is that when they first get kind of to the planet, when they first arrive to the atmosphere of the planet, they end up getting a video message that they have to watch that actually features Guy Pearce in old man makeup as he plays Peter Weyland, of course the man behind the Weyland Company, who is a big part of all of these films. We hadn't seen him up to this point in the films, of course, but here we see him as a very, very old man, and he's pretty much saying that, listen, I sent you guys off on this mission because I believed in what you guys, you know, had to say. I believe in what Elizabeth Shaw believes in, that these might be the makers of humanity and they might be able to give us some answers, but I'm probably going to be long dead by the time you guys arrive there. Only for us to learn later on in the film that David knew the entire time that Weyland was actually aboard the ship, and there's actually a handful of individuals that are part of the crew that actually knew that he was on the ship, this old man, and actually came and was in hypersleep the entire time, and actually wanted to come because he believes if these engineers are actually the creators of humankind, maybe they can help him live longer. So he has his own ulterior motive, and David is working to do what he can to help Weyland, you know, find his way to these engineers. And amidst all this, we end up learning that Charlize Theron, who is kind of the leader of this ship at the time, even though she's not really calling all the shots, and she's kind of there just to kind of get in the way of the scientists more often than not in the film, but we end up learning that she's actually the daughter of Peter Weyland. It doesn't really play the biggest significance in the story. It's a moment where they try to be like super dramatic about the reveal that she is his daughter. She doesn't really have tons to do in the film, but it's at least an interesting thing to mention. But yeah, Peter Weyland is on the ship, and we're going to get back to that in just a little bit. So when the whole crew shows up to this planet now, they find the ship again that is very similar to what we see in the original Alien film. They go aboard, and they pretty quickly learn that the engineers that they've come to find are dead. They find a dead body of one of them, a few of them over time, and they learn that something terrible happened here to these engineers. They then end up finding this room that has a huge sculpture of one of these engineers' faces in a room filled with a bunch of vases that have some black goo coming out of them. This is where we're introduced also to a snake-like face hugger that appears, which is where things start to go awry. Unfortunately, some of this black goo ends up getting into some of our characters, including the love interest of Elizabeth Shaw, Dr. Charlie Holloway, and he and some others on board unfortunately end up becoming infected and start to die and start to kind of get a little bit crazy, start to kind of turn into almost like zombie-like characters. This of course leads to the death of all of those characters, unfortunately also Charlie Holloway, the love interest of Elizabeth Shaw, and now everything is just kind of going to shit. And David still wants to kind of uncover things, and as time goes on, they end up learning that there seems to be some sort of life form somewhere, which David ends up uncovering, and it turns out that there is one of these engineers left. And David ends up keeping this under wraps until he goes and wakes up Peter Weyland, as I mentioned before, where he then tells everybody, including Dr. Shaw, who did not know that this engineer was alive, that they now need to go back into the ship to actually see this engineer that's still alive. They end up waking this engineer up, and that was the worst idea they possibly could have done, because the engineer just decides to fuck everybody up, kills Peter Weyland, ends up ripping the head off of David, and Elizabeth Shaw ends up being the only one who's able to escape. And I should also mention before that the reason that Dr. Holloway was even infected with this black goo is actually because of David. David unfortunately used the black goo and put it into a drink, and this is part of those malicious intents that we've seen with him. He wanted to kind of see what happens when some of these characters come in contact with some of these goo, and he also wanted to kind of disrupt the system so that he's able to kind of be a snake amidst all of the chaos. And amidst all of this going on, Elizabeth Shaw ends up getting impregnated by one of these creatures as well. She ends up learning that she is pretty well along in this process. And earlier in the film, and I should have mentioned this earlier, sorry, I'm jumping all around. There's a lot to talk about in this film, actually. But earlier in the film, we learned that in Charlize Theron's quarters, there was this high-tech surgery device that was mainly meant for men, but she ends up seeing that earlier in the film. And when she learns she's impregnated with one of these creatures, it leads to one of the most iconic and one of the best acted scenes in this film, one of the standout scenes in this film, which is where Dr. Elizabeth Shaw ends up going to this device and awake ends up undergoing a surgery where they remove this alien from her stomach. It's some sort of squid-like, almost face hugger type of creature that she's able to eventually remove from her stomach, is able to get sealed up. She goes through a whole surgery while she's awake and ends up escaping that area to get out of there and try to find David so that she can escape. Amidst all of this, this creature is actually growing in that room that she left him in, and later on she ends up going back to that original room where the engineer was, ends up getting David, his head, his body, takes him out of that room. David ends up saying, "The engineer is coming for you." At this point, the engineer has wiped out pretty much everybody else, except for a few people who are still on board the main ship. I know I'm bouncing around a lot here, sorry about that. And yeah, so she ends up escaping this situation. This leads to a whole situation where the engineer is coming after her at the later part of the film, which I think is so cool. And the engineer actually gets impregnated by the creature that was inside of Dr. Shaw. I hope you guys are following along, and if you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. And this ends up leading eventually to our first look at the first kind of xenomorph in these films that is a little bit different in its design, but super cool. I like the digital effects here. The digital effects element is something that I've been very critical of when it comes down to a lot of these films, because some of these came out in the early days of digital effects, and with these films being so great when it comes to the practical work, I think the Alien franchise hasn't always done the best job when it comes down to digital effects in comparison to the practical effects. But I think that Ridley Scott did an incredible job here of using digital effects to enhance certain sequences while also using plenty of practical effects as well to kind of blend them a lot of times to end up with a very satisfying look to a lot of these creatures and to a lot of these sequences that still holds up. Again, 12 years later, I think that this movie could come out today and still look just as good as plenty of movies that come out today, if not better than some, because that's an issue that we have these days. A lot of movies are being rushed out, and some of the CGI isn't as crisp as films from 10, 15, 20 years ago, which is a damn shame. And amidst all of this going on as well, you have Noomi Rapace's character, Dr. Shaw, warning the main craft that has Idris Elba and Benedict Wong on it, saying, that alien spaceship is about to take off that has the engineers kind of like black goo on it. We cannot let that leave. It's going to go straight for Earth. It's going to be a big problem for us. And Idris Elba and the rest of the gang that are on board, there's just 3 guys, decide to sacrifice themselves, and they go and end up crashing straight into the ship in the kamikaze mission there to make sure that that does not get back to Earth. In a lot of ways, this film kind of reminded me of like the Rogue One of the Alien franchise, as most of the characters are taken out, and in a lot of ways, they go there and they find out that this is all going to kind of be a threat to them and to the humanity. And, you know, Idris Elba, Benedict Wong, they end up working together to take out this ship, and I thought that was really, really cool. You also have Amon Elliott amidst all of that going on as well. And so, yeah, really strong cast across the board. So much going on, so much connective tissue to the original Alien film, and also something that felt new and fresh. These engineer creatures are so interesting. I think that they are definitely a new element to the lore that I've always really enjoyed. Seeing kind of the early formation of the xenomorph in this film, I also think is an excellent part that was introduced here, and kind of being able to show us the phases. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into Alien Covenant, which is the second film in these prequel films. Unfortunately, Ridley Scott was meant to release a third film that was supposed to come out after Alien Covenant and kind of round out the trilogy, but he ended up not making the film, both I think because he didn't really love the reception that this one and Alien Covenant got, but I could be wrong on this, but I almost want to say that maybe there was something wrong with like the box office portion of it as well, unfortunately. But he ended up not making that third film. So you do have this part of Alien Covenant that does feel like it's a little bit open-ended and does leave a couple of things, not necessarily closed, but at the same time, I think it ends in a way where it kind of leaves things in a way where you're like, okay, I can see how this kind of just flows in to the original Alien films. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the transitions of the xenomorphs in that film, as that kind of gets us more to the classic xenomorph that we're more familiar with. But when it comes to this film, I really enjoy the design of the new xenomorph and some of the other face huggers that we're introduced to here. I really enjoy the look of these engineer creatures. We do get to see a little bit more of them and learn a little bit more about them in Alien Covenant, and we'll talk about that then. But as far as what was introduced here, I thought that was really cool. And so in the end of the day, everybody ends up dying, whether it's to the disease from the virus that comes from that black goo, whether it be from some of these face hugger creatures, or whether it be from, the engineer themselves, or just characters backstabbing one another, or suicide to save the human race. There's a lot that happens in this film, so many characters. In some areas, too many characters. I think with these films, sometimes because they're horror films in a lot of ways, you got to have a lot of characters that can kind of be fodder to die. There's a few too many characters that maybe you just kind of forget are even in this movie, that are just small background crew members. Again, some of them are kind of needed to just be those characters that die. A couple of them maybe could have been shelved, didn't really need them. I think the Charlize Theron element of this film is probably the most useless part, because her being the daughter of Peter Weyland really never really adds much to the story, and she never really does much with that information. She just kind of plays this character who's kind of jealous that her father doesn't seem to believe in her enough. She kind of just feels like that classic trope of child and offspring to somebody who's way more important, who doesn't really give them the role that they hope that they would have, and that nobody around them really respects them how they feel they should be respected because of who their parent is. But on paper, I also don't think Charlize Theron's character really does much. She ends up kind of just dying in the film in the latter half, trying to escape, and there really isn't much to her. But it's nice to see other people in here like Idris Elba or Benedict Wong, and I think Noomi Rapace, like I mentioned before, gives the best performance here, not only in tons of moments in this film when she's learning things and she's this really interesting character who's excited to find the engineers, and then of course ends up being heartbroken, realizing that this is not what she would actually want, and she loses her love of her life amidst all this. But most notably in that sequence with the surgery, just top tier performance there. That alone steals the show, and I think it's one of the most standout moments in the entirety of the franchise. It's grotesque, it's tense, the music is great, the cinematography, the performance, it's just everything about it is so well done in that sequence. And overall, this is just an entertaining, fun movie in the Alien franchise that I think, has a lot of ambitious swings. I think Ridley Scott swung for the fences, and I can see why some people think that this movie doesn't feel too much like an Alien film, but at the same time, I think it does. And I think it does enough really cool, fun, different things to give it its own identity in the Alien franchise. And so the movie ends with the fact that now Noomi Rapace's character is the last survivor of the human gang. She has David dismembered, but she's going to fix him, and we'll learn about that in the next film. She ends up stealing one of these alien crafts of the engineers, and she sets off into space to go back to their home world in hopes of finding more answers. So the movie actually ends, while very bleak on a lot of levels, with a really positive message or tone that she's going to go out there, she's going to save the day, she's going to find the engineers, and she's going to do what she came out here to accomplish. And it would be such a shame, similar to Aliens into Alien 3, it would just be such a shame if this ending wasn't just absolutely ruined at the very beginning of the next movie. I guess we'll have to talk about Alien Covenant when that film comes. But overall, guys, I think that Prometheus is a badass Alien film that does a lot for a prequel. There's a couple of things I would have cut here and there, a couple of characters that don't work all that much for me. There's some elements about it, like, again, that just feel like, why do we include this, with Charlize Theron's character being one of the least interesting elements of this film. And I would even kind of venture to say that Peter Weyland's element in this film, while interesting, never really serves much to the story. But when it comes down to these characters that are in search of the creators of man, only to get there and kind of be thrown into a horror movie and, you know, kind of see the creation of the early forms of the xenomorphs, I think this film does a good job of posing a lot of interesting questions, leaving things open-ended for the next film, but also just being a really interesting prequel to the lore of the Alien franchise, because at this point, it has started to become kind of cookie cutter before this, you know. It just kind of became, all right, characters are going to go, they're going to find xenomorphs, you know, the main character and all, in the case of the other ones, Ripley is going to go around and tell everybody what the problem is, what they should do, how they should stay away from it. Nobody's going to stay away from it. They're going to end up all being, you know, face hugged. They're going to have a chest burster pop out, a xenomorph's going to grow, and they're going to kill everybody. And that's kind of what, you know, the formula started becoming. And I love that this film, that Ridley Scott came back and did something different. And for whatever gripes I have with this film, I'm just grateful that this film has its own identity. And 12 years later, honestly, I love Prometheus now more than I ever have, and I look forward to revisiting it in the future, most notably for Noomi Rapace's character. I think her performance is without a doubt one of the best in the entire franchise. So thank you guys so much for watching this long video. I had a lot to talk about here with Prometheus. It's one of those movies that's jam-packed with a lot going on, but I had a lot of fun talking about it with you guys, and I look forward to talking about Alien Covenant as the next video in this franchise. And yeah, guys, after that, I'm going to make my way through the rest of the Predator films I have not covered. I've covered the original Predator and the last two that came out, The Predator and Prey. So we're going to go through Predator 2 on to the next few, and then we're going to do Alien versus Predator. I don't know that I'm going to get that all done before Alien Romulus comes out, but I wanted to make sure I at least got the Alien films done, except for Alien versus Predator, before we got to Alien Romulus. So thank you guys so much for watching these videos. I hope you guys have been enjoying them, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.